Good morning. I've got my thing on today because it's a little bit cold outside. This is the third video in astrological thinking, and I wanted to unfold and develop some of the ideas that are presented in the first two about rationality and irrationality, or the poetic frame of mind, which includes what Ficino would call soul. And Ficino, Marsilio Ficino, 15th century, brought astrology back in a particular way that enabled people to relate to it and relate to its concepts, the planets, the signs, and so on, as not just metaphor, but as a means to contact certain inner realities which give the soul purpose and meaning and colour and atmosphere. Now, by soul, he meant something like the animating spirit. That which gives value, personal value, as well as a value of hierarchical values. It gives purpose to the mind. It gives, if there's no soul in anything, the mind is divorced, because he placed this divorce from the body, because he said that the soul of things is an interplay, is a kind of middle ground between the processes of the body and the processes of the intellect. And the intellect can be obviously put into two frames. One is the abstract conceptual ideation of philosophical intellect, and the other is that of discursive reason and scientific, not discursive reason, but the scientific fact. But we won't get into too much about the rational mind today. But I was talking about it in the other videos because this whole conceptual scheme of astrology and symbolism and the natural order, the order of the solar system, and its connection to a poetic frame of mind, was an attempt to participate in the soul of things. And so to give the mind a whole scheme, I think, by which it could be ordered and work through these so-called unknowns of essences and spirits within us. Spirits in a modern sense aren't just disembodied entities. The spirit of something is rather like a continuing pattern over evolutionary time. It moves in and out of things, and a spirit of something, a spirit of a particular place, but also has a soul. And if we're too over intellectual about this, if we don't allow a world of what Campbell calls an as if reality, then things are disembodied. The mind is connected to the body in Ficinian terms through the soul. Not just through feeling, but atmospheric meaning, interiority, thinking about and acting in a poetic way. It's like the spontaneous use of dance, or just movement, or the odd inflection here of meaning, or a point towards some meaning. It might not be a differentiated meaning particularly, or a meaning that can be spread out or used or thought about. It's the difference between descriptive thought, I suppose, and poetic meaning, particularly in the Romantic poets. Suddenly thinking of Wordsworth and his the famous daffodils, of course, which as far as my memory goes about that, I think there was some kind of pact that him and Samuel Coleridge had, where Coleridge would do poetry which somehow invoked the transcendental meaning, whereas Wordsworth would use external beauty, the soul in things, and his poetry is used to describe that. I wandered lonely as a cloud, um, or, or dales and vales and hills, when all at once I came across a host of golden daffodils. Not very well read, sorry about that. But he wasn't just describing a walk, like I went outside the door, walked up a hill, and came back. He is invoking, in that process of imaginative description, he literally invokes, through the use of the word and image, a sensation, a feeling, an experience. Because he was walking out with his sister. He wasn't alone when he walked out. But this whole feeling of being alive with meaning, and him trying to describe the imaginative, lived emotional experience of a kind of a reverie, in a way. And that reverie gives soul and meaning to things. It wasn't just I walked up a hill and back again. Um, what is it? The last verse of that, something to do with besides the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So the daffodils weren't just moving around in the wind; they were dancing. They were fluttering, and you can imagine that as the sun fell on the lake and on the daffodils, that this kind of shimmer or of dazzling light would come off of the daffodils and just kind of create this sense of beauty or awe. So when we're working in the imaginative realm, the realm of poetic imagination, or anything that uses that, so like astrology, although astrology has an ordered element to it, not to get lost amidst this field of imagination and symbolic reality which can take you anywhere. He's talking about, as I say, the lived experience. So when an astrologer is working on a placement in a horoscope, he starts, or she starts, with that, and starts to amplify the meaning through the principles and practice of astrology, through certain lines of thought, which then generate other thoughts. And we don't know quite how the placement in a horoscope, or the placement, actually seems to accord. Well, it actually does accord with the person. A study of this over a long time has proved the case time and time again. Sometimes it doesn't accord so strongly with people, and I think critics like James Randi, for example, have done us a very good favour in his criticism of the way that astrologers are rather loose in their thinking about what they do. I think these criticisms are valid, and we have yet really to formulate an accurate representation of astrology as working through this dimension of a structured system of symbols. That there are rules to the imagination. There's a logic of symbolism which takes place in the unconscious somewhere, at certain primitive levels of thought, magical thinking and symbolic thinking, and paleologic, as von Domerus talks about. Now I'm going to talk about that in another lecture, about the layered structures of pre-verbal logic which exist in certain planes of the mind, and involve us not in irrationality as such, or the logic of Aristotelian logic, but takes us into a place of similarity, symbolic connection, all floating around in a sea of perception linked with feelings and associations. That's why we need, actually, a structured system of symbols, so that when we delve into the imaginative realms, we don't get lost, because we have a pattern to differentiate. Saturn is in this house, the sun is opposed to a particular planet, or there is this ascendant, and all these avenues of exploration in terms of personality, or the character of a person, or sometimes, if you're a more practical astrologer, what people can do with their lives. This is an application of the symbol of actuality. What Ficino, talks about when he's talking about symbolism or meaning coming into the body. So unless we have this world of soul, poetic imagination, which astrology in its essence allows us to play with. There's a creative side, much creative side to astrology, aside from its technicalities and all that you have to learn in order to be familiar with it. There is an allowing of an as if quality, as if this. And then when it's explored, and the territory of this symbolism explored with the person, as it does in the horoscope reading, then these meanings evoke genuine experiences. So for some astrologers, they may have a psychic sense which picks up somehow in the transference or telepathy or something. Maybe it's a bit of unconscious perception of the person in front of you, and then you can talk about a sun sign and then it will relate to the actual person. But that's not the whole of it. That is a part of it. And as I say, I think critics and people like Randy have done us a great service to show up where our lack of clarity of thinking and the articulation of what we do is unclear or muddled or based on superstition. So the soul of things, James Hillman's psychology was about, or Thomas More was about, he talked about Ficino in a wonderful book called The Planets Within. Ficino's natural magic was about the use of these the inner life of imagery to get a kind of movement in the emotions. You can tell when the soul is activated, when there's an emotional element to it that evokes personal memory or awe or things like. So it is based on body. You see, the soul is the mediator of the upper realms. The soul or psyche is the mediator of the upper realms of the mind, abstract thought, and perhaps even the intelligences in the cosmos or in the heavens. And of course, when Ficino was talking about the heavens, he actually meant the astrological universe up there. And it mediates the body too. So when the body gives sensation or reactions to things, then it hits off an imaginative experience. And we get involved in a drama, or we get involved in a romantic reverie of some kind that's meaningful. Intellect can show or describe meaning in factual terms and so on, but without it, life is dry. So, in its essence, then, I think astrology allows us a guided tour, a kind of guided imagery, if you like, from which to play with the imagination. Yes, there are rules and things that one has to learn about the vocabulary of astrology and so on. But once it's found, the art of it, I think, is to do with play. It's to do with a creative form, which, as I said in the last video, is something to do with discussing or having a collaboration between image and intellect. The other thing that I wanted to say here is that what's come out in recent years, particularly with the company of astrologers, people such as Jeffrey Cornelius and Maggie Hyde, and I draw those two names because they're kind of figureheads, I think, for a type of reinvention of the Ficinian overview of life, the Ficinian approach to life as soul making, rather than just seeing a fixed system through which astrology can be interpreted. Now, in my one of my first lectures in 1988, it used to be called holistic astrology, and I would discuss the different levels of interpretation in an attempt to broaden out the ways in which people could use astrology. And what I saw in those early days, that usually astrology was presented alongside some other medium through which it could be interpreted, such as psychology. And I don't think that that's a problem. One needs to have a rational frame or an idea about something through which the symbolism of astrology can be articulated. Those are called contexts of meaning. Uh, and often the popular context to meaning of astrology is it shows character, it shows what you're going to do next week when the moon crosses your fourth house or something like that. It attempts to literalize the placements of the planets in terms of events or situations, or Mars is going across this, and so if you're not careful, your car's going to bash into something or something. Now, all of these are literal interpretations and to a certain extent are valid. As I said the other day about a spontaneous example of Saturn in the third house, might show as a long-term melancholia, but that's a literal interpretation which may or may not actualize at that particular level in a particular person. But we still have the scheme of Saturn in the third house, which is a pattern in a person's life, which will be there somewhere, which they'll take on as part of their character and their personality. So we have to have these schemes of interpretation. There's been a major outpouring since the mid-1970s of linking psychology with Noel Till's system of needs and motivations and so on, which was a wonderful beginning, I think, renewing and refreshing astrology symbolism in terms of behavior and what you could do with the horoscope to participate in the symbolism rather than just have a fixed future, which is a rather fatalistic dimension. Alan Leo started off on theosophical astrology and tried to link the astrological symbolism to a theosophical system of planes of consciousness and karma and reincarnation and star angels and various things like that. So there's been attempts over the years. Dame Roger has a system of transpersonal interpretation of forces of life, forces of transpersonal forces of life working through us in an attempt to get somewhere. His astrology is largely based on a whole system of cycles that we go through with the planets, and you can see that the planets may be a valid system of recognizing what forces are operating in us but through us that we more or less have to go along with, which links to Jung, that we must gladly do what we're supposed to do in life. It's as if there is a pre-programmed seed or potential in us which evolves, which might be called the myth of the individual journey. And then we get back to Campbell and so on. So astrology, in league with these other forms of interpretation and ideas, psychology, character association, horary astrology is the use of astrology in a particularly an inquiry, or the judicial astrology, the branch of judicial astrology. But what's coming into operation at the moment also is this divination of the symbol itself, to see what it has to tell us as a form of guidance. And this is a kind of rather like I talked about with Wordsworth, where we use astrology to invoke in us some kind of movement of the soul, which then can affect the mind or affect the body. It's in terms of a movement. Sometimes when I'm looking at a horoscope position or something, I might get a feeling in my body, or I might get an emotion or a sensation, and from that I can then interpret. Or I might go into it from an intellectual side and work through a particular delineation of typical meanings, which is the keyword element to astrology. So there are these two sides going on in the practical use of astrology, and I may come to some of these look at the particular methods and processes of thinking that take place within interpretation, particularly the von Domerus principle of similarity and association, which is so important to the basis of astrological thought.